Why are we here? So for the last year, I've talked to elected officials, I've talked to community leaders, some of you in the room, I've talked to citizens, friends of mine, and most of them have asked me two questions. They've said, is Common Cause going to support a constitutional convention, and can you tell me a little bit more what a convention would be like? So the answer to the first question is easy. Our organization, most of the board of which I think is in the audience, hasn't taken a position yet. We're going to wait and see what happens with this General Assembly session. But historically, in the last two cycles, we've opposed conventions, along with, or the convention question, along with many of the groups represented today. Best I can tell, and there may be people in the room who have the history better than I, in 1984, the first time this question went on the ballot, we did support it. And there was a convention, as we know, in 1986. The second question is really why we're here today. I felt, and I think other people have felt, that there isn't enough information out there about what a convention would look like, what issues might arise at a convention, what the election of the delegates might look like. While numerous groups have already started staking out positions, so we know Operation Clean Government is for a convention, the Secular Humanists, the ACLU, other groups are against a convention. There hasn't been a public forum to really talk about the mechanics of a convention yet. So we thought that this would be a good time to pause and look at that and look at the issues that might arise. Just walking in, I talked to somebody from RIC who said they're planning on trying to have more forums in the fall. So I think this will be the first or second of many forums on this topic. So what I want to talk about is a little bit today, to start us off, is the November ballot question, and if that passes, what the statute that will have to be passed by the General Assembly is going to look like, and that statute is going to authorize the election of delegates. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the nature of the special election that would be held to select those delegates. And then finally, a little bit about the structure of an actual convention, how they might construct their business, and finally some of the issues that we might see at a convention. So let's start with Article 14, Section 2 of the Constitution. I put them on the table out there. I got here a little late, so you all might not have them. But there was a one-page sheet that on one side had the constitutional language. That's the reason we're here. This section of the Constitution was put into the Constitution in 1974. Patrick Conley, who many of you have heard speak in other venues, claims ownership and authorship of that. And it replaced a rather cumbersome process that we had in our prior Constitution for amending the Constitution. And it replaced it with a pretty clean and understandable couple of ways to amend our Constitution. I'm not going to talk about Section 1. Section 1 deals with how the legislature puts a question on. But I'm going to talk about Section 2. And it begins with, the General Assembly, by a vote of a majority of the members elected to each House, may at any general election submit the question, shall there be a convention to amend or revise the Constitution, to the qualified electors of the state? If the question be not submitted to the people at some time during any period of 10 years, the Secretary of State shall submit it at the next general election following said period. To the best of my knowledge, the General Assembly has never passed the necessary resolutions to put it on the ballot, so it's come down to the Secretary of State putting it on the ballot every 10 years. We certainly know that the General Assembly has never put it on in between the 10-year period. The second sentence, beginning with, if the question be not submitted, has a little bit of a muddled history. In 2013, as I said, Dr. Conley, who authored this, testified before the Rhode Island Senate that it was his interpretation that meant the question goes on the ballot in 2016. And we're a little premature here in March of 2014. His interpretation was that the Secretary of State puts it on only if the legislature doesn't put it on in a 10-year period, they put it on at the next election. However, Secretary of State Mullis, our current Secretary of State, has decided to follow the precedent set by Kathleen Connell in 1994 as interpreting that sentence to mean that the question goes on this year. And I don't want to dwell on that because it's settled. Our Secretary of State is on the record saying the questions could be on the ballot this November. However, it's worth noting that the Rhode Island Senate, and I see Senator Hodgson here, has already gone ahead and passed their resolution that would put this on the ballot. There's no indication the House is going to do it, certainly not after the events of the last week. I wouldn't expect to see the House act on this very hastily. So we know the question is going to be on the ballot. So the next section of Article 2, or Article 14, Section 2 reads, prior to a vote by the qualified electors on the holding of a convention, the General Assembly, or the Governor, if the General Assembly fails to act, shall provide for a bipartisan preparatory commission to assemble information on constitutional questions for the electors. Okay, so this is the next phase. The General Assembly has the option of creating a commission. If the General Assembly doesn't create the commission, the Governor can create the commission. In the last 3 cycles that this has happened, we've seen it work both ways. So the General Assembly has in the past created a commission. In 1984 and 2004, those commissions were constituted and met. In 1994, the General Assembly failed to act, and the Governor failed to act until literally the day before the election. Bruce Sundlun issued an executive order creating the commission. So he went through he went through with that, although obviously the commission never met and made any recommendations or assembled any information. And the Rhode Island Senate, should be noted, has also passed a resolution to create that commission, and I probably don't expect that the House will anytime soon. But given that our current governor, Chafee, has stated his support for a convention, I would expect him likely to fulfill his constitutional duty under that section if the House does fail to act. A couple of interesting things. One, Gary Sass, who spoke earlier, I believe holds the record as the only person ever to be appointed to all 3 of those commissions. So if there's a Hall of Fame of Constitutional Preparatory Commissions, Gary is in that Hall of Fame. The 1984 Commission held 5 public hearings around the state. Interestingly, they endorsed a convention. I think there are members of that commission here today. They took the affirmative step of endorsing having a convention. They went through a number of possible changes to the Constitution, but they didn't endorse any of those changes. In 2004, the Commission, again, it held 6 public hearings. They claimed to have heard from 62 members of the public. They did not take a position on whether there should be a convention, but like the 84 Commission, they identified a number of issues, including some that were repeated from 20 years prior, that they believed would be raised if a convention took place. They also did something else which was interesting and I think helpful, which is they tried to come at the question of how much a convention would cost. And I think there'll be questions about that today. And they came to an estimate of approximately $2 million. So this was 10 years ago. So, as I said, I expect the commission will be created. I expect they'll meet and produce a report. But one thing to keep in mind, if you look back at the 1984 Commission report, I'm going to try to put both of these reports up on the Common Cause website. And they're fairly brief, they're 10 pages each, they're worth reading. Many of the issues raised in the 84 Commission report didn't subsequently come out of the 86 Convention. So maybe we shouldn't put too much weight into these preparatory Commission reports. So, as I've said, the question has come before the voters 3 times since the 1974 changes of the Constitution. In 1984, as we know, it passed. It got 53.8% of the votes. In 1994, it was defeated. It only received 40.5% of the votes. And in 2004, the most recent time it was on the ballot, it received 48% of the votes. So it lost by a fairly slim margin. What are the chances this time? I've been asked. I know, I'm sure other folks here have been asked. The only thing we have to go on is a January 2013 poll by Public Policy Polling, where they did, I believe, a sample of roughly 500 Rhode Islanders, and it came up with 40% of Rhode Islanders supporting, 25% opposing, and 35% undecided. And really, that poll is another reason why we're here today. There's a lot of people who are undecided about this question so far. We think public education is an important part of helping those people. So next, what I want to talk about is a little bit about what happens if the vote occurs, or passes, excuse me, if the question passes. So if you move on in Article 14, Section 2, it says, if a majority of the electors voting at such election on said question shall vote to hold a convention, the General Assembly at its next session shall provide by law for the election of delegates to such convention. The number of delegates shall be equal to the number of members of the House of Representatives, and shall be apportioned in the same manner as the members of the House of Representatives. So obviously our only experience with this section is in 1985, and there's one big difference that many of you know from 1985 to 2014, which is that we've downsized the legislature. So we've gone from 100 House districts to 75 House districts. And that will obviously have some impact on what a convention would look like. So in 1985, on June 27, 1985, an authorizing statute went into effect without the governor's signature to form the convention itself. And we can get quite a bit of information, particularly about the election of delegates, from what that statute said. Interestingly, it said that it would be a non-partisan election of delegates. The Preparatory Commission in 2004 concluded that it doesn't have to be a non-partisan election of delegates. It could be done on a partisan basis. But the only example we have in Rhode Island history since 1974 is a non-partisan election. It's worth noting that prior conventions, prior to 1974, I believe 10 prior conventions were elected on a partisan basis. So in 1985, that election was an anomaly in our constitutional history. The statute went on to talk about some of the parameters for that election. It said that all applicable election laws, including voter registration and campaign finance laws, apply to the election of delegates. I was unable this week to find campaign finance records from 1985. They may exist, but I wasn't able to get a hold of them. So we don't know how much the delegates raised and spent, although that should be a question that can be answered. I do know that under current Rhode Island election law, as many of you know, there are no restrictions on spending by a candidate for office, but there are restrictions on how much they can raise, $1,000 a year per contributor as a maximum. A couple of other quick things. The ballot order is determined by lots drawn by the Secretary of State. The delegates, if a delegate cannot serve, the next highest vote getter will serve in their place. And candidates only need 50 qualified signatures to get on the ballot. So it's a fairly low threshold. So what did we see happen in 1985? By the way, the election occurred in November of 1985. It was an off-year election held concurrent with some municipal elections in the state. But in most communities, this was the only election that occurred. 558 people ran, so that averages out right to 5.5 people per district. There were 96,536 votes cast, so you had an average of a little under 1,000 voters per district. How does this compare? Well, I went and looked at the 1986 general election and the ballots cast for members of the House in 1986. There were 273,502 votes cast just a year later in the general election, so 2,735 votes per district, so roughly 3 times the number of voters in a regular election. So it was a very low turnout election in 1985, more comparable to a primary election. What did the delegates who were selected look like? Well, unfortunately, we don't have any demographic information. The only thing I could glean from the list was that 21 of the 100 delegates were women. So that's something of note. And that many of the delegates have gone on to lead very public lives in the public service. So a couple of notable names. Governors Bruce Sundlun and current Governor Lincoln Chafee were delegates. Congressman Jim Langevin was the Secretary of the Convention. Former Rhode Island Supreme Court Chief Justice Frank Williams, and then many members later of the General Assembly, including current Senate Majority Whip Marion Goodwin, were delegates, as well as other people involved in civic life, not through elective office in the state. A couple of notable names of folks who ran but did not succeed: current Senate President Piva Weed, and I assume when I looked in the records, Judge Flanders, that you ran? No, you didn't. There was a Robert Flanders who ran and did not succeed. So there are 2 Robert Flanders in this state. Before moving on to the convention itself, which I'll try to get to really quickly here, there's one last sentence in Article 14, Section 2. It says, "No revision or amendment of this Constitution agreed upon by such convention shall take effect until the same has been submitted to the electors and approved by a majority of those voting thereon." So, as many of you know, in 1986, when the convention concluded, it delivered 14 questions that were on the 1986 ballot, 8 of which passed. So let me briefly look at the convention itself. The same statute that authorized the special election called the convention for January 6th, 1986, and stated that the convention would be subject to the Access to Public Records Act as well as the Open Meetings Act, unlike the General Assembly. It gave them the power to ask the Supreme Court for advisory opinions, and it gave them subpoena power at the vote of a quarter of the delegates. So, as I said, it was called to order on January 6th. It organized itself into 6 substantive committees and 3 organizational committees. The substantive committees included one on citizens' rights, one on ethics in government, one on the executive branch and independent agencies, one on the General Assembly and elections, one on the judiciary, and one on local government. The organizational committees included a public information committee, a rules committee, and an important style and drafting committee. After they organized themselves, they did a bit of a road show. They went around the state, had 11 public hearings around the state in the month of February and early March, which saw over 1,000 people testify. They set an early April deadline for the delegates to submit resolutions, and they saw 322 resolutions proposed. You can go, I won't go through them, but in the archives, there are copies of the resolutions and lists of the resolutions that are very useful to look through. They represented, some issues of the day, right? Divestiture against the apartheid government in South Africa, but some timeless issues of constitutional law too. The 6 substantive committees held 111 meetings, 34 public hearings, and they heard from a wide variety of groups, including our group. They produced 32 policy reports, 22 legal reports. They had a somewhat significant staff. They operated, interestingly, on a very similar schedule to the General Assembly. So the bulk of their business was done between January 26th in January 6th and June 26th, the traditional end of the legislative session, the last week in June. And I would, all of this is gathered from the state archives and that have the records of the convention, which are also held at Providence College and are worth going through. There were 10 plenary sessions, so once the committees reported out, and they reported out, they had 43 committee reports, 24 resolutions. Those plenary sessions winnowed it down to 14 ballot questions, which were put on the November ballot. As I mentioned earlier, there was a cost to this. The cost of the 1986 convention in $1986 was $891,000. So putting that in today's dollars, that's $1.8 million. So what did they put on the ballot? Well, they put 14 questions. They put a rewrite of the present Constitution, which was a neutral rewrite, taking the 44 amendments that had been made in the prior 150 years, and adding gender-neutral language and other things. They put that was approved. They put a question on judicial selection to create a merit selection system of judges. That was rejected. They put a question on legislative pay, to increase legislative pay and make some other changes. That was rejected. They put a question on to give the general officers four-year terms of office and allow for recall. That was rejected. They put a system of voter initiative, and that was actually much discussed. There was actually a subcommittee of the committee to look at that question, and that was rejected. They created the Rhode Island Ethics Commission. That was approved. They gave the governor a role in the state budget process and made the Speaker of the House third in line for succession, and that was approved. There was a catch-all amendment dealing with a number of civil liberties issues that was approved. There was an environmental and shore use amendment that expanded the power of the state and local governments to protect the rights of fishery and privileges of the shore, which was approved. There was a question on felon office holding and voting that was approved. There was a question on libraries and making the General Assembly responsible for providing for libraries, approved. There was a question about denying bail in the cases of some drug crimes, which was approved. There was a question about home rule, strengthening home rule in the state, which was rejected. And there was, most famously, a right to life question that would have limited access to abortion services that was rejected. The convention came back together on December 4th and ratified the results of the election. So, trying to get a handle on what might happen if there's a convention in 2016, we went through and figured the best way to look at it was what issues have come before the General Assembly in the last 10 years. So we went through every resolution in the last 10 years introduced to amend the state constitution. And there was an article, or there was a piece out on the table that we produced that showed there were 157 amendments in the last 10 years on 33 unique topics. They clustered around areas of legislative and executive reform, although interestingly not a single one on judicial reform, as well as fiscal issues and a sprinkling of other topics, including civil rights. So I would urge you to look through that document because I think that's the best indication of maybe what is going to be coming up in a convention. I'm getting the wind up signal. I'm just going to mention that in the last 10 years there have been 6 questions put by the General Assembly to amend the Constitution on casinos, on changing the state's name, on helping the rainy day fund of the state. And they met with mixed results. And I guess in the interest of time, I'm going to try to wrap up there. I hope this has been helpful. I hope this answers the basic question of what one of these things is going to look like, what the question is going to look like, what in November, what the special election of the delegates would look like, and what a convention broadly would look like. Unfortunately, there aren't any great, I wish I could say, go read this book. There's a great narrative of what happened in 1984 through 1986. There isn't a single volume that tells that story. So I hope this has been helpful. Now we'll turn it over to the real experts from Rutgers who are going to try to put this a little bit in comparative perspective. So thank you very much.